Ma'am, we need to see your papers.
My papers? I'm Navajo. My family has been on this land for thousands of years.
Well, that's not how immigration law works.
3 IC agents walked up to a Native American woman loading groceries into her truck and demanded she prove she belonged in America. Her people had been on that land for thousands of years before there was an America to belong to, before borders, before immigration laws, before the United States even existed. But none of that mattered to the agents who saw brown skin, heard an indigenous name, and assumed criminality. What happened that bright Tuesday morning outside the Shiprock Trading Post would become a $22.4 million lesson in the cost of ignorance, federal overreach, and the violence of treating indigenous people like foreigners in their own homeland. It was a clear Tuesday morning in Shiprock, New Mexico. Highway 491 cut through Navajo Nation land, the asphalt shimmering under the climbing desert sun. The red sandstone mesas rose in the distance, ancient and unmoved, watching over land that had belonged to the Dine people since time immemorial. Out here, federal jurisdiction was supposed to respect tribal sovereignty. That morning, 3 IC agents proved they either didn't know that or didn't care. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments because I genuinely want to know who's hearing this story. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared. Your support helps us bring more truth to light. Sage Blackwater was doing something completely ordinary when her life was turned upside down. The 38-year-old nurse practitioner had stopped at the Shiprock Trading Post on her way home from a night shift at the Indian Health Service Clinic. 12 hours of caring for patients, most of them elders from her community, dealing with diabetes, heart disease, the chronic health issues that plagued reservation healthcare. She was exhausted. Her scrubs were in a bag in the back seat. She'd changed into jeans and a gray t-shirt before leaving the clinic, her turquoise necklace, a gift from her grandmother, resting against her chest. She'd picked up milk, bread, some canned goods, traditional fry bread ingredients for her grandmother who was expecting her for dinner. Just routine shopping, the kind of thing she did twice a week. She was loading the brown paper bags into the bed of her red Ford F-150, arranging them so nothing would roll around on the 15-mile drive to her grandmother's Hogan, when the black SUV with government plates pulled into the gravel parking lot. Sage didn't think much of it at first. Federal vehicles weren't uncommon in this part of the Navajo Nation. Bureau of Indian Affairs, Indian Health Service, various tribal liaisons, they all drove similar SUVs with government tags. She continued organizing her groceries, making sure the eggs wouldn't crack, the bread wouldn't get crushed. But then she noticed the way the 3 agents approached. Not casual, not friendly, purposeful, with that particular kind of aggressive confidence that comes from people who believe their authority is absolute, who've never been told no, who've never had to question whether they belong somewhere. Agent Warren Foster led the group. White male, mid-40s, crew cut, tactical vest with police ice in large white letters across his chest. His body camera was already recording the small red light visible on his vest strap. Behind him were Agent Jessica Chin, Asian American woman in her late 20s, and Agent Raymond Burke, white male in his early 30s wearing a black tactical mask and sunglasses despite it being early morning. Both had their cameras rolling. The footage from all 3 cameras would later become Exhibits A through C in a federal civil rights case that would make legal history. "Excuse me, ma'am," Foster called out, his hand already resting on his belt near his handcuffs. "We need to speak with you." Sage looked up, squinting against the bright desert sun. The morning light created harsh shadows across the red rock landscape. "Can I help you?" Foster's eyes scanned her, taking in her long black hair pulled back in a traditional bun, her brown skin, her turquoise necklace, her jeans and t-shirt. His mind had already made its calculation. She looked indigenous. Therefore, she must be from somewhere else. Therefore, she needed to prove she belonged here. "We're with Immigration and Customs Enforcement," Foster said, his voice flat and official. "We need to see your identification and proof of citizenship." The words hung in the desert air like something foreign and absurd. Sage stood there for a moment, one hand still on a grocery bag, genuinely confused. I'm sorry, what? Your papers, Burke chimed in, stepping closer, his masked face making him look more like a soldier in occupied territory than a law enforcement officer. Citizenship documentation. We have reason to believe you may be in this country illegally. Sage's confusion shifted into something else. Not fear. Anger. The kind of deep ancestral anger that comes from generations of being treated like foreigners in your own homeland. The anger her grandmother had warned her about. The anger that indigenous people carry in their bones from centuries of colonization. Forced removal, cultural erasure, and being told they don't belong on land their ancestors have inhabited since before recorded history. I'm Navajo, she said slowly, deliberately, her voice steady but hard as the red rocks behind her. My family has been on this land for thousands of years. Chin pulled out a tablet, checking something on the screen. Ma'am, that's not how immigration law works. We need to see documentation proving you're a United States citizen. You're standing on the Navajo Nation, Sage said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. This is sovereign tribal land. You have no jurisdiction here without tribal permission. And even if you did, I'm Native American. My ancestors were here before your country existed. Foster's expression hardened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he'd already decided was probably illegal. His record, which would be thoroughly examined during the lawsuit, showed a disturbing pattern. Over his 12-year career with ICE, he'd targeted indigenous people throughout the Southwest, operating under the racist assumption that brown skin and proximity to the border meant undocumented status. He'd been counseled twice about respecting tribal sovereignty. He'd been sent to mandatory training on indigenous rights. He'd ignored it all. Federal authority supersedes tribal jurisdiction in immigration matters, Foster stated, reciting something he'd been taught but didn't fully understand. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. Show me your identification. Sage reached slowly into her truck's cab, pulling out her purse from the passenger seat. She extracted her driver's license and held it up. Here. New Mexico driver's license. Issued right here in Farmington. My name is Sage Blackwater. I'm registered member number 847362 of the Navajo Nation. I work as a nurse practitioner at the Indian Health Service Clinic in Shiprock. I'm as American as anyone can be. More American than you, considering my ancestors have been here since time immemorial. Foster barely glanced at the license. He'd already made his decision. That doesn't prove citizenship. You could have obtained that illegally. We need a birth certificate, passport, or naturalization papers. I don't carry my birth certificate with me to buy groceries, Sage said, her patience wearing dangerously thin. Who does? I'm a registered member of the Navajo Nation. I'm a licensed nurse practitioner with the Indian Health Service. I pay taxes. I vote. I'm a United States citizen by birth, and I'm also a citizen of the Navajo Nation, which has existed on this land longer than your country has existed anywhere. Burke's hand moved toward his handcuffs, the movement deliberate and threatening. Ma'am, you're being uncooperative. If you can't provide proof of citizenship right now, we have the authority to detain you for verification. A pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. An elderly Navajo man emerged, his weathered face showing 70-some years of desert sun and hard living. He saw what was happening. 3 federal agents surrounding a Navajo woman at her truck, and immediately pulled out his phone, starting to record. He'd seen this before. Maybe not ICE, but federal agents overstepping, tribal members being harassed, sovereignty being violated. The Navajo community had learned long ago to document everything. Within minutes, 2 more vehicles had arrived, drawn by the sight of federal agents and the elderly man's urgent phone calls. The Navajo community had learned to watch out for each other, especially when federal authority came calling. Sage noticed the gathering witnesses and felt a small measure of relief. Whatever happened next would be documented, not just by the agent's body cameras, but by her own people. I'm telling you right now, Sage said, her voice rising with both anger and certainty. You're making a serious mistake. I'm a United States citizen by birth. I'm Native American. My people were here first. You don't have probable cause to detain me. You don't have jurisdiction on tribal land. And you sure as hell don't have the right to demand papers from an indigenous woman buying groceries on her own ancestral homeland. Foster was done talking. His jaw set, his hand moving to her arm. Turn around. Hands behind your back. For what? Sage's voice carried across the parking lot. Several people at the trading post entrance had stopped to watch. More phones came out. I've shown you my license. I've told you who I am, where I work, where I'm enrolled. You have no probable cause to detain me. Failure to provide proof of citizenship, suspicious behavior, and now resisting a lawful detention, Foster said, grabbing her arm roughly. Sage pulled back instinctively, a reflex anyone would have when grabbed without warning. Don't touch me. This isn't lawful. You're on tribal land without permission. You're violating my rights and tribal sovereignty. But Foster wasn't listening. He forced her arm behind her back, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. Burke moved in to help, grabbing her other arm. The sound of metal handcuffs clicking shut echoed across the parking lot, sharp and final. The witnesses gasped. Someone shouted in Navajo words of protest and disbelief. Chin stood back, her body camera capturing everything. Later, in her deposition, she would admit she felt uncomfortable watching it happen. She knew it was wrong. But Foster was the senior agent. She was still on probation with the agency, and she was afraid to speak up. So she stood there and recorded a civil rights violation because her career felt more important than doing the right thing. The elderly man who'd been recording approached, his voice shaking with anger. You can't do this. She's dying. This is our land. You have no right. Foster turned on him, his face flushed. Sir, step back right now or you'll be arrested for interfering with federal officers. Call the tribal police, Sage shouted to the growing crowd, her voice strong despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists. Call my family. Call everyone. These agents just arrested a Native American woman on tribal land for not carrying a birth certificate to the grocery store. By now, Linda Morrison, the white woman who'd run the Shiprock Trading Post for 30 years, had come outside. She knew Sage. She knew most of the Navajo families who shopped there. Officers, I know Sage. She's local. She's Navajo. She works at the IHS clinic. This is crazy. You're making a mistake. Foster ignored her, guiding Sage toward the black SUV. The handcuffs were tight, already cutting off circulation, leaving red marks on her brown skin. The desert sun beat down, making the metal hot against her wrists. You're making a mistake, Sage said, her voice clear despite the humiliation of being arrested in front of her community, in front of elders who knew her family, in front of people she'd cared for as patients. A very expensive mistake. They loaded her into the back of the SUV. The door slammed shut with terrible finality. Through the tinted window, she could see more people gathering. More phones recording. More witnesses to federal agents arresting an indigenous woman for being indigenous. Have you ever been accused of something so absurd you couldn't even process it? Drop a comment because what Sage was experiencing, being told to prove her right to exist in her own homeland, would get much worse before justice arrived. The drive to the ICE field office in Farmington took 40 minutes. 40 long minutes during which Sage sat in handcuffs, unable to wipe away the tears of rage and humiliation that streamed down her face. Her mind raced through everything. She thought about her grandmother, born in a hogan with no electricity or running water, who'd survived the boarding schools designed to erase Navajo culture, who'd been punished for speaking her own language as a child, who'd raised 7 children on this land and taught them all to be proud of who they were. Her grandmother who was waiting for her to bring groceries for dinner, who would instead get a phone call saying her granddaughter had been arrested. She thought about her own daughter, 8 years old, who would come home from school at the reservation elementary to hear that federal agents had arrested her mother. How do you explain that to a child? How do you tell her that in this country, even though her people were here first, they're still treated like they don't belong? She thought about every ancestor who'd walked this land before highways existed, before the United States claimed sovereignty over Navajo territory, before anyone called them Native Americans, because there was no America to be native to yet. Generations of people who'd lived here, died here, were buried in this red earth. And she was being taken away from that land in handcuffs because a federal agent saw brown skin and assumed foreigner. The irony burned. She had a master's degree in nursing from the University of New Mexico. She'd served her community for 15 years, providing health care in underserved areas where few providers wanted to work. She paid federal taxes. She voted in U.S. elections. She'd done everything right according to the rules of the country that had colonized her ancestors' land. And here she was, handcuffed in the back of a government vehicle, being treated like a criminal for having brown skin and shopping at a trading post on her own ancestral homeland. When they arrived at the ICE field office in Farmington, they took her to a holding room. Concrete walls painted institutional beige. Fluorescent lights humming overhead. A metal table and chairs bolted to the floor. The room smelled like disinfectant and fear. Foster finally removed the handcuffs. Sage rubbed her wrists where the skin was raw and inflamed, red welts already forming. She'd have bruises tomorrow. Evidence. Sit, Foster ordered, pointing to one of the metal chairs. Sage remained standing, her back straight, her chin up. Years of being told to sit, to comply, to accept whatever treatment was given. Not this time. I want my lawyer. I want to contact my tribal council. And I want to know exactly what law you think I've broken. Foster slammed a folder onto the metal table, the sound echoing in the small room. You failed to provide proof of citizenship when asked by federal officers conducting immigration enforcement. That's enough to hold you while we verify your status. I'm enrolled in the Navajo Nation, Sage said slowly, deliberately, as if explaining to someone who'd failed basic civics. That's a matter of public record. My enrollment number is 847362. You could have verified it in 5 minutes with one phone call. But you didn't because you saw a brown woman at a trading post and assumed she was illegal. You didn't see a nurse practitioner. You didn't see a tribal member. You didn't see a United States citizen. You just saw brown skin and made your decision. Burke shifted uncomfortably near the door. Even he was starting to realize this might not go the way Foster had planned. The confidence that had radiated from all 3 agents in the parking lot was beginning to crack. Your tribal enrollment doesn't automatically confer U.S. citizenship, Foster said, though he sounded less certain now, like he was trying to convince himself more than Sage. Actually, it does, Sage countered, her voice sharp with the precision of someone who knew her history, who'd studied the laws that governed her people's existence. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 granted citizenship to all Native Americans born in the United States. I was born in Shiprock, New Mexico, which last I checked is still part of the United States. I'm a citizen by birth. And I'm also a member of a sovereign nation that predates your country by thousands of years. So you can verify my citizenship or you can violate my civil rights further. Your choice. But either way, I'm documenting everything, and my attorney will be here soon. The door opened. A supervisor entered, Sharon Gonzalez, a middle-aged Latina woman whose expression suggested she already knew this was a disaster. She'd received a call from the Navajo Nation president's office, then another from the tribal police chief, then another from a civil rights attorney who was already drafting a lawsuit, and then the regional director had called, asking what the hell was happening in Farmington. Foster, outside. Now. Gonzalez's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. In the hallway, away from Sage but still captured on body camera audio that would later be subpoenaed, Gonzalez tore into Foster with the fury of a supervisor who knew her region's budget was about to get decimated by a lawsuit. Do you have any idea what you've done? That woman is a registered tribal member with the Navajo Nation. She works for Indian Health Service. She's a decorated nurse practitioner with 15 years of service. And you arrested her for shopping at a trading post on her own tribal land without a single piece of evidence that she'd committed any violation. She couldn't provide proof of citizenship, Foster protested weakly, his confidence evaporating under his supervisor's glare. She showed you a driver's license. She told you she was Navajo. She gave you her tribal enrollment number. You had no probable cause for any of this. None. Zero. And now her attorney is already filing a federal civil rights lawsuit. The tribal council is demanding an investigation. The media is lighting up with footage of you handcuffing a Native American woman on tribal land. Do you understand what you've done? Should federal agents be required to undergo mandatory training on tribal sovereignty and indigenous rights before being allowed to operate anywhere near tribal lands? Comment below, because what happened to Sage Blackwater wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of federal overreach that had targeted Native communities for generations. Inside the holding room, Sage sat calmly on the outside, though inside she was anything but calm. She was calculating, remembering every violation, every protocol they'd broken, every right they'd trampled. She was already building her case in her mind. 15 years of dealing with bureaucracy had taught her that documentation was everything, and they'd documented their own violations. When Gonzalez came back into the room, her tone was completely different. Professional, apologetic, damage control. Ms. Blackwater, I sincerely apologize. There's been a serious misunderstanding. You're free to go. We're releasing you immediately. Sage stood slowly, deliberately. A misunderstanding? You arrested me. You handcuffed me in front of my community. You transported me 40 miles. You held me in this room. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a civil rights violation. That's racial profiling. That's federal agents not understanding or respecting tribal sovereignty. We're releasing you with no charges, Gonzalez said, trying to salvage something, anything. Of course no charges will be filed, Sage said, her voice cold and precise. Because you have no charges. You had no probable cause. You had nothing except racial profiling and ignorance about tribal sovereignty. You saw a Navajo woman and assumed she didn't belong on Navajo land. Think about that. Outside the ICE field office, a crowd had gathered. Tribal members who'd driven from Shiprock. Supporters from other pueblos and reservations. Local media with cameras. All waiting. When Sage emerged, still rubbing her bruised wrists, cameras flashed and questions erupted. She stood on the concrete steps of the federal building. The afternoon sun now lowering in the west, painting the desert in shades of amber and red that her ancestors had watched for thousands of years. She didn't shy away from the cameras. She didn't hide. She spoke clearly, confidently, her voice carrying across the parking lot with the same strength her grandmother had taught her. Today, 3 ICE agents arrested me on Navajo Nation land because I couldn't produce a birth certificate while buying groceries for my grandmother. I'm a Navajo woman. My ancestors have lived on this land since before borders existed, before immigration laws existed, before the United States existed. And I was treated like a criminal in my own homeland. This isn't just about me. This is about every Native person who's been treated like a foreigner in the land their people have inhabited for thousands of years. This is about federal agents who don't understand tribal sovereignty, who don't recognize indigenous citizenship, who profile based on skin color and make assumptions based on racist stereotypes. This is about a system that still, in 2024, treats indigenous people like we're the immigrants, like we're the ones who need to prove we belong, when the truth is we've been here longer than any immigration law, longer than any border, longer than America itself. This ends here. We're filing a federal lawsuit, and we're going to make sure every agent who operates near tribal lands understands that tribal sovereignty is real, that indigenous people are citizens, and that we will not be treated like foreigners in our own homeland anymore. The footage went viral within hours. The image of a Native American woman, tears on her face, turquoise necklace visible against her gray shirt, being arrested and asked for citizenship papers on indigenous land, it struck a nerve across the country. Indigenous rights organizations rallied. Legal scholars weighed in on the violations of both individual rights and tribal sovereignty. Civil rights advocates called it one of the clearest cases of racial profiling they'd ever seen. The video of her statement on the courthouse steps was shared millions of times. The lawsuit was filed within a week. Sage hired a legal team that included both non-native civil rights attorneys from the ACLU and Native legal advocates who specialized in tribal sovereignty issues. The complaint was devastating in its detail: violation of Fourth Amendment rights, unlawful seizure without probable cause, false arrest and false imprisonment, racial profiling based on indigenous identity and appearance, violation of tribal sovereignty under federal law, intentional infliction of emotional distress, deprivation of civil rights under color of federal authority. The defendants, the three agents personally, ICE as an agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and the United States government. The damages sought: $22.4 million. The discovery process was brutal for the defense. The body camera footage showed everything: Foster's immediate assumption of illegal status, the dismissal of Sage's explanation, the violation of tribal land jurisdiction, the aggressive escalation despite no probable cause, Burke and Chin's complicity through silence. But discovery revealed something even more damning. Foster had a history, pattern. Over his 12-year career, he'd made 47 arrests of Native Americans in or near tribal lands. 47. Of those 47 arrests, 42 had been dismissed for lack of probable cause. 42 times he'd arrested indigenous people without legal justification. He'd been counseled twice about respecting tribal sovereignty. He'd been sent to training on indigenous rights. He'd ignored it all, continuing to target Native people based on appearance alone. The deposition of Sage Blackwater was powerful and devastating. Her attorney walked her through the entire experience, but also through the broader context. Ms. Blackwater, can you describe what it felt like to be arrested on Navajo land and asked to prove your citizenship? Sage took a breath, gathering herself. It felt like erasure. Like everything my ancestors survived: colonization, forced removal, boarding schools, cultural genocide was still happening, just in a different form. My grandmother was taken from her family at age 5 and sent to a boarding school where she was beaten for speaking Navajo. She was told her culture was savage, that she needed to become white to be American. And 70 years later, I'm being arrested on that same land and told to prove I'm American enough. Felt like history repeating itself. Like we'll never be seen as fully human, fully American, fully belonging to land that's been ours since before America existed. How did it affect you? I have nightmares now, about being grabbed, about handcuffs, about my daughter watching me be taken away. I have anxiety when I see federal vehicles. I second-guess myself when I'm out in public, wondering if I should carry my enrollment papers, my birth certificate, every document that proves I exist and have a right to be here. And I'm angry. Angry that in 2024, indigenous people still have to prove we belong in our own homeland. The trial team presented expert testimony on tribal sovereignty, on the history of federal abuse of Native communities, on the psychological impact of racial profiling on indigenous people. They presented evidence of Foster's pattern of targeting Native people. They showed how the arrest violated not just individual rights but tribal sovereignty itself. The defense tried to argue that Foster had acted in good faith based on Sage's inability to immediately produce citizenship documents. But the argument fell apart under scrutiny. She showed him a driver's license. Sage's attorney argued in court. She told him she was Navajo. She told him where she worked. She explained tribal sovereignty. She gave him her enrollment number. He had every opportunity to verify her status without arrest. He chose not to because he'd already decided, based solely on her brown skin and indigenous appearance, that she was illegal. That's not good faith. That's racism. That's profiling. That's exactly what the Fourth Amendment protects against. The case drew national attention. Native American advocacy groups filed amicus briefs. The National Congress of American Indians submitted a brief on tribal sovereignty. Legal scholars wrote about the implications. Media coverage was extensive, with many outlets drawing parallels to historical injustices against indigenous communities. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury included 2 Native Americans, a Pueblo man and a Tejano Owatem woman, both of whom had family experiences with similar profiling. The testimony was damning. The body camera footage was played repeatedly, each viewing making the violation more obvious. Foster took the stand. Under direct examination by his attorney, he tried to explain his actions. But under cross-examination, he fell apart. Agent Foster, when Ms. Blackwater told you she was Navajo, what did you think that meant? That she was claiming to be Native American. Did you believe her? I needed proof. But you didn't attempt to verify her claim through any official channels before arresting her, did you? No. I believed immediate detention was necessary. Necessary based on what probable cause? Silence. Agent Foster, answer the question. What probable cause did you have to believe Ms. Blackwater was in the country illegally? She couldn't produce citizenship documents on the spot. She produced a driver's license and explained she was an enrolled tribal member. That wasn't enough for you. I've encountered fraudulent documents before. Did you have any specific reason to believe her license was fake? No. Did you run her license to check its validity? No. Did you contact the Navajo Nation to verify her enrollment? No. Did you contact the Indian Health Service to verify her employment? No. Did you do anything to verify her status except look at her brown skin and decide she must be illegal? The defense attorney objected, but the damage was done. The courtroom was silent. Chin's testimony was particularly devastating. She admitted she'd felt the arrest was wrong but didn't speak up. I was the newest agent on the team. Foster was training me. I was taught to follow his lead, not to question senior agents. I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth. You have body camera footage showing you witnessed a civil rights violation. Did you report it? No. Why not? A long pause. I was afraid of retaliation, afraid of being labeled a troublemaker, afraid of losing my job before I'd even really started it. So you chose your career over protecting someone's constitutional rights? Chin's voice broke. Yes, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Watching that footage, seeing Sage's face, knowing I could have stopped it and didn't, I'll carry that forever. Burke's testimony was similar, though less remorseful. He maintained he'd been following orders, that Foster was the senior agent, that he'd assumed Foster knew what he was doing. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, their faces were serious. The verdict was read. Liable on all counts. The damages, $22.4 million. $8 million in compensatory damages to Sage Blackwater for the violation of her constitutional rights, the emotional trauma, the ongoing psychological impact. $14.4 million in punitive damages, specifically designed to send a message that this behavior, racial profiling of indigenous people, violation of tribal sovereignty, arrests without probable cause, would not be tolerated. The jury foreman, a retired Pueblo teacher named Michael Abeda, spoke after the verdict. His words would be quoted in law journals and civil rights textbooks. We wanted to make sure the government understood that Native people aren't foreigners. We've been here since before there was a United States. We're citizens. We're sovereign nations. And we deserve to be treated with respect, not suspicion. This verdict is for every Native person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong in their own homeland. For every indigenous person who's been profiled, detained, told to prove they're American enough. This ends now. The reaction was seismic. Native communities across the country celebrated. Indigenous rights organizations held it up as a landmark victory. Legal experts called it one of the most significant tribal sovereignty cases in decades. Foster was fired and permanently barred from federal law enforcement. Burke was suspended for 2 years without pay and required to undergo extensive civil rights training before he could return. Chin received probation and mandatory retraining, her cooperation with the investigation earning her some leniency. But the impact went far beyond individual accountability. The case triggered systemic reforms. ICE implemented mandatory training on tribal sovereignty for all agents operating within 100 miles of tribal lands. New protocols were established requiring verification through tribal enrollment offices before any arrest on or near reservations. Oversight mechanisms were created to track patterns of targeting Native communities. Agents who violated tribal sovereignty protections would face automatic review and potential termination. The Navajo Nation used the case to push for greater jurisdictional clarity, working with other tribes to establish stronger legal protections against federal overreach. Legislation was introduced in Congress to strengthen tribal sovereignty protections and create specific criminal penalties for federal agents who violated them. Sage Blackwater became an unexpected advocate. She spoke at tribal councils, at universities, at legal conferences, at indigenous rights gatherings. She talked about what happened to her, but more importantly, she talked about the broader context, about indigenous people being treated as perpetual foreigners despite being the original inhabitants of this land. She used a portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for Native people facing similar violations. The fund provided free legal representation to indigenous people targeted by federal law enforcement, helping dozens of cases in its first year. She funded scholarships for Native students pursuing law degrees, hoping to build a new generation of legal advocates who understood tribal sovereignty from lived experience. Her daughter, now understanding more about what happened, wrote a school essay that won a national Indigenous youth writing competition. She wrote about her mother's courage, about how standing up to injustice, even when it's scary, is important, about how their ancestors had survived colonization, boarding schools, forced removal, cultural erasure, and they'd survived this too. Sage's grandmother, who'd watched the news coverage with tears streaming down her weathered face, said something that stayed with Sage forever. They tried to make you prove you belong on land where our people have always belonged. But you proved something else, my granddaughter. You proved they can't break us. They never could. Not with boarding schools. Not with forced removal. Not with trying to erase our language and culture. And not with handcuffs and demands for papers. We're still here. We'll always be here. This is our land. It always was. The Shiprock Trading Post where it happened put up a historical marker. Not to commemorate the arrest, but to commemorate the resistance. To remind people that in this place, a Navajo woman stood up for her rights, for her people's sovereignty, for the truth that indigenous people aren't immigrants in their own homeland. Years later, Sage still shops at that trading post. She still loads groceries into her red Ford F-150 in that same parking lot. But now when federal vehicles pull in, the agents nod respectfully. Some have approached her to apologize, to say they've been through the new training, to promise they understand better now. She accepts their apologies, but doesn't let them forget. The training is good, she tells them, but understanding has to go deeper than a PowerPoint presentation. You need to understand that when you see Native people, you're seeing people whose families have been here since time began. We're not the immigrants. We never were. And treating us like we don't belong is a violence that echoes through generations. You're learning protocols now, but you also need to learn history. You need to learn that your badge doesn't give you the right to question someone's humanity based on the color of their skin. The case is taught in law schools now, studied by students learning about civil rights, tribal sovereignty, federal accountability. The body camera footage is used in training sessions across law enforcement agencies as an example of what not to do, how implicit bias and ignorance of indigenous rights can lead to catastrophic violations. The $22.4 million settlement remains one of the largest ever awarded in a tribal sovereignty civil rights case. But for Sage and her community, the number was never really the point. The point was recognition, acknowledgement, a public admission that what happened was wrong, illegal, and rooted in racism that sees brown skin and assumes illegality, even when that brown skin belongs to people who've inhabited this land since before borders existed. The red rocks outside Shiprock still stand, ancient and unmoved. They watched as Spanish colonizers arrived and claimed the land. They watched as American settlers pushed westward and drew new borders. They watched as the federal government created reservations and tried to contain indigenous nations. They watched as generations of Navajo people struggled to maintain their identity, their sovereignty, their right to exist on their own terms. And on that bright Tuesday morning, they watched as 3 federal agents made a choice that would cost them everything, because they couldn't see past their biases long enough to recognize that the woman they were arresting had more claim to this land than any immigration law could ever acknowledge. Sometimes justice takes the form of money. Sometimes it takes the form of policy change. Sometimes it takes the form of legal precedent. But always, it takes the form of truth being acknowledged, of wrongs being named, of systems being forced to confront the harm they've caused. Sage Blackwater got all three, and in getting them, she opened a door for every Native person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, to walk through and say, "We were here first, we're still here, and you can't make us prove our right to exist in our own homeland anymore." If you believe that indigenous sovereignty matters, that racial profiling must end, and that knowing history is essential to achieving justice, subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like Sage's prove that the arc of justice is long, but it bends toward accountability when people refuse to accept injustice.